Evening to all of you at University of Hyderabad. Thank you for inviting me to talk about Kashmiri Women's Resistance Day. Now, almost a month ago, I was at university, your university, discussing various issues, including the question of the disconnect between nationalism and democracy. Often in post-colonial context, what we see is that the idea of nation is used to not only bring unity in the country, but also to demonize those who differ from the mainstream idea of nationalism. And therefore, nationalism can become a useful tool in the hands of the elite to challenge the democratic rights of a few people or often even of the majority. If you take example of India, as we have seen in case of let's say Rohit Vemula or Kanhaiya Kumar or Umar Khalid, you can see very clearly that those who speak in the name of the nation often discriminate against a number of communities and use the idea of nationalism to force a certain kind of unity upon everyone and in the process demonize them and take away human rights of many. Now, Kashmir is an interesting concept as well as an interesting subject to study. Now, for those of you who may not heard me before, so let me repeat it for you. In India, the usual rhetoric is that Kashmir is an integral part of the country. Fine. What it means is crucial. What it means is, for some, the idea that India is a sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic, of which Jammu and Kashmir is a state, one of the many. But for many, what it implies is that Jammu and Kashmir is territorially part of India. Now the question is, in case of Kashmir in particular, of course there are other areas also in India, but in case of Kashmir, there's a big disconnect between what majority of the people, specifically in Kashmir Valley, aspire towards and what the Indian state is willing to give to them. Now, the Indian state, by claiming that Kashmir is an integral part of the country, denies them the right to self-determination. Right to self-determination is something very simple. It is for a collective, it is for a nationality, it is for a national group, or it is for a political community that sees itself as belonging to a particular nation to decide for itself whether it wants to be part of the existing country, it wants to secede, or it wants to sort of it wants to revise the kind of relationship it has with the country it's part of. Now, in case of Kashmir, in 1947, when Indian troops went and occupied parts of Kashmir and Pakistani troops went and occupied other parts of Jammu and Kashmir, both India and Pakistan had promised to Kashmiri people the right to self-determination. In fact, this promise was part and parcel of UN resolutions in 1947 and 48. And yet, Indian government has backtracked from that and never ever fulfilled the promise it had made to Kashmiri people. Now, many Indian nationalists would argue that Kashmir is vital for the country and therefore it cannot be allowed to secede. This kind of argument on surface might seem practical, but it's only practical from the perspective of those in India, not from those living in Kashmir. For instance, in this particular context, think of a, let's say, domestic arrangement. Think of a marriage, right? You have a situation of domestic abuse, you have a situation of bullying and intimidation by various people. And yet, the dominant partner might argue, or the abusive partner might argue, that regardless of what the other person thinks, he or she has to stick with them, whether they like it or not. And that is the kind of relationship we are talking in context of Kashmir and India. So those who argue that Kashmir is an integral part of the country, therefore, often associate with certain ideas of super patriotism, where you cannot question Indian position on Kashmir, and that would allow the Indian state, including the military and non-military, to commit grave human rights abuses in Kashmir and get away with it. Now, as those people in India, and I'm assuming that most of you are living in India, whether you consider yourself Indian or not, for those of you, there is a moral dilemma here. Do you side with the state that is willing to use your ideology and your support to kill, rape? Yes, I'll go into that very soon. Kill, rape, occupy, torture, and do everything possible in terms of by denying democratic and human rights to Kashmiris, and democratic right includes right to self-determination? Or would you question that state and argue that states exist for people, people don't exist for the state? That is, the state cannot use the idea of nationalism and of the nation to deny human rights abuse to people who don't feel that they belong to the state. Now, of course, that is about self-determination and right to self-determination in Kashmir. Now, the very fact that you're sitting there and possibly listening to me and listening to others would imply that you have some awareness of what has gone on in Kashmir, and you also are those amongst those people who do not believe that state or nationalism should be allowed to ride roughshod over every kind of human rights in different parts of the country. So I'm assuming that there's a certain shared sensibility between us that state exists for the people, and therefore state has to respect human rights of the people, and that those human rights include right to self-determination. Now, the discussion today, or the topic today I'm going to cover, is more about women and resistance in Kashmir. There's a particular colonialist trope that presents the colonial power as a occupying, but also as liberator. So there's the whole idea of emancipation. Now, with emancipation, let me give an example. When Napoleon went to Egypt, he did not declare himself to be a conqueror and occupier. He assured Egyptian people that he was there to liberate them from the tyrannical rule of the Ottomans. When British went to Tibet, yes, British did invade Tibet in 1903, 1904, they argued that they're liberating ordinary Tibetan people from the Lamaist system. The reason I mention these examples to remind you that the fact that an occupying state claims to be liberated and emancipator does not imply that it is actually liberated and emancipator. Similar thing is with, for instance, what India is doing in Kashmir. So rhetoric, or at least one of the tropes or narrative that's used by Indian occupation in Kashmir, is that Kashmir is a conservative society, there's a deep-rooted patriarchy, and somehow Indian groups, including Indian feminist groups, are there to protect Kashmiri women from Kashmiri men. That often talk of how, of course, women are underrepresented, for instance, in militancy, and women underrepresented in political power, women groups are underrepresented in most aspects of resistance. It's a fair point in the sense that, yes, patriarchy does exist in Kashmir. But those of you who are from India, you also know how patriarchy exists in India itself. Where in India do you find women having equal rights? Where in India do you find women not being subjected to all kinds of violence in the hands of men? Where in India do you not find, be it military or anti-military, left-wing or right-wing, do you find women having equality? So the question of patriarchy in Kashmir should not be allowed to blind us to the fact that the key problem in Kashmir is patriarchy, but that's a patriarchal militarized state rather than patriarchy of the resistance. Now, it is for Kashmiris, including Kashmiri women and men, to reflect upon the patriarchies that exist and why, for instance, women in general tend to be underrepresented. So why, for instance, a lot of time the rhetoric of the resistance talks about or refers to women as victims rather than political agents, right? So that's for them to decide, for Kashmiris to discuss. And again, for those of you who don't know, already many Kashmiri women have been arguing along those lines. For instance, they should have equal rights in deciding what the future holds for them. But the biggest form of violence that takes place in Kashmir is not necessarily within the household, not necessarily within the society, but is vis-a-vis the state. And without dismantling the patriarchal state there, or rather, without dismantling the patriarchal military occupation in Kashmir, we cannot expect to counter, or rather, even Kashmiris cannot expect to counter the patriarchy patriarchies that exist within the society. Right? Now, in terms of how patriarchy or how gendered violence has taken place in Kashmir, let's talk epistemic violence. And epistemic violence would be where, again, Kashmiris are seen as people who do not have the capacity to govern themselves, and therefore they need India to govern them. One of the arguments made by Indian nationalists again is along the lines that if they give freedom to Kashmir, if they give Azadi to Kashmir, then Pakistan will take them over. Now again, there is this denial, or rather there's this view that Kashmiris cannot have the capacity or the agency to manage their own lives on their own, therefore they need a protector. Imagine, this whole language of protection should remind you of the ways in which patriarchal values function, which is a woman, or rather a feminized figure, cannot be trusted to be on its own and therefore needs constant protection. So India is somehow the one that's protecting Kashmir and Kashmir Valley and others, of course, from Pakistan or evil Pakistan. That's one kind of rhetoric that's used. So that's at epistemic level. But in everyday form, What we have found is since 1990s, when there was a military uprising against India, and since then, of course, it has been crushed, but they have been violent and also violent and mostly non-violent resistance against India. What we find is that Indian state has used very gendered violence against Kashmiris. Gendered violence includes not only, let's say, rape, not only in rape of individual women, but also mass rape such as Konan Pushpura. I hope some speaker would be expanding that for you. But a mass rape where the soldiers and the militarized individuals have committed sexual violence and torture and rape against women. That's the most brutal and obvious form in which women have been victimized in Kashmir. There have also been rape and sexual torture and sexual violence against men. Now, if we take example of Bosnia or other places where sexual violence has been against men by the occupying and the by occupying power and the dominant power, what you find is that the purpose of sexual violence, which is practically rape, right? The purpose of rape is not, and it has nothing to do with the desire. It's to punish the other side and to show that they have been emasculated. So there is a particular gender ideology that's at play here. That gender ideology is one where the one that is raping is seen as the powerful and therefore the man, and the one being raped, be it a man or a woman, is seen as someone who's weak, someone who has lost their honor and hence emasculated and therefore deserving of always being under control. Therefore, those people who think that Indian state has legitimate rights to control Kashmir, regardless of the methods that they use, including violence, in a sense, they're complicit with brutal sexual violence and rape of Kashmiri body politic by the Indian state. Let's keep that in mind. And this is specifically for those who are still big fanboys and fangirls of Indian state in Kashmir. Now, in terms of resistance, when we take example of Kashmir, of course, if we talk of rape and sexual violence, it's a normal, or rather, it's common tendency to view those things in terms of victimization only. And that no doubt is there. So when we say that women have political agency in Kashmir, I don't mean to argue that there hasn't been victimization. But apart from rape and sexual, let me give you another example. And this again I have raised in Hyderabad itself a month ago. Take example of this calendar, right? This calendar is from Association of Parents for Disappeared Persons, APDP, which is headed by Parveena Ahangar. She had lost her son, her son was disappeared forcibly by Indian state. And for last 26 years, she had been waiting for some news about the son, and there has been no news. She's not on her own. She's not a lone victim. There are between 8 to 10,000 Kashmiris who have been victims of enforced disappearance in Kashmir. Now, what that does is, you may think that the victims are men. Of course, they are men. Those who have been disappeared, almost all of them. But women also become victims because those women whose husbands are disappeared, they become what's called half widows, the life always in limbo. Mothers whose son is disappeared, they have lifelong trauma. And in most cases, since disappeared are those coming from poor family, you could see that the person who could win, or rather who could bring bread and everything, they are out, and therefore it further pushes into poverty. Apart from trauma, emotional trauma and political trauma, it pushes them into more further poverty. And there are very few mechanisms in place in Kashmir. Of course, there's no mechanism supported by the state or quasi-state, and there's some by APDP and other organizations, right? But there is no proper mechanism to support these women. So they have to rely upon, for instance, committed activists such as Parveena Ahangar. Parveena Ahangar, I would say, is one of the examples of how Kashmiri women have been resisting colonization by India. Yes, it is colonization. Parveena Ahangar is not on her own. If you happen to go to Kashmir, listen, given the fact that you live in India, most of you, right, or rather you are living in India right now, you don't need visa to go to Kashmir. There is no excuse for you not to go there. I would advise you and counsel you to go to Kashmir around 10th of every month, or rather 10th of one month, because APDP has its own vigil reminding the state and reminding the world that it has disappeared various people and they're not going to be forgotten. So they commemorate those who have been disappeared and they're still waiting for them. Go there please on 10th of a particular month, or on 30th of August, which is the International Day for the Disappeared. Please go. Just observe, remember, be in solidarity. Our role as outsiders is not to speak for them, not to speak about them even, but in certain sense to learn from Kashmiris, to learn from those women who have been struggling, coming there almost every month, still in hope that the sons or brothers or husbands would be brought back. Go there and you'll find women who are very strong, women who may not even speak Urdu or Hindi, but they may speak only Kashmiri. They may not be very literate, but they are much more educated than you or me. They would tell you exactly under which law, which battalion of the Indian Army or paramilitary took away the son. So women who are seen as illiterate, not all of course, some of them, women who are seen as illiterate, have been more educated than us in the true nature of Indian state and true nature of Indian colonial occupation. They are the women who can be our teachers because they can teach to us what blind faith in nationalism can do to us. It can corrode our humanity. It can make us, again, immune to human feelings and realization that in the end, my old argument, state should be subservient to people and human rights than the other way around. So women have been resisting, and I gave you an example of APDP, Parveena Ahangar, and other women who were doing that. Women, if you take example of recent cases where women have come out and protested against the government, protested against the military, protested against paramilitary, protested against the police, you see very clearly that women resist in everyday life. You may not have, apart from Parveena Ahangar and Asiya Andrabi, of a very different ideology of Duktarane Millat, very conservative ideology, it's like and different. But apart from them and a couple of other prominent women, you may not find many women resisting state in terms of the leadership aspect. But please let's keep this in mind that nationalist movements are not only about leaders. Yes, often leaders are the figures in front, but nationalist movements and especially anti-colonial movements are largely about what the wider population does. Go to Kashmir, speak to women there, you'll find from them, again, even they might not know political science the way some of us might do, they might not understand laws the way some of us might do in terms of statute and everything else, they might not even understand the topography and cartography of India. They might not understand exactly how the international relations functions. But believe me, they know more than you or me how the cartography of India has violently occupied and controlled Kashmir. They can tell you in exact forms how laws operate to put them under erasure and their identity under erasure at various points in time, and how they themselves, by simply encouraging their sons and daughters to live, survive, get educated, may do something with life and not get exterminated very easily, many of them, right? So not get exterminated very easily. They are doing their level best to remind the world that Kashmir has not given up. Kashmir will not give it up until and unless they get the right to self-determination, which includes right to be free, right to have dignified living, right to be free of the military patriarchal state, and then right for themselves, or rather right for themselves to struggle against patriarchies within. Right? Overall, when you look at or when you try to understand the way in which women have resisted the state, and when I say resisted, I'm not romanticizing it, I'm not glamorizing it, nor am I claiming that there are no problems within the community. I'm sure there are problems within the community like any other community. But in the end, it is for Kashmiris to do something about it. An Indian feminist position that is more Indian than feminist, I'm afraid, is not feminist. For simple reason, because a true feminist position would be one that privileges equality and rights of all human beings, specifically female-identified human beings, to assert their own political agencies. For those of you who consider yourself to be feminist, those of you who consider yourself to be believer of human rights, and therefore, in one particular, in certain sense, those who believe that state should be held accountable, and therefore you're supporters of democracy, it is very important that we have, and you have, certain kind of sensibility and empathy towards Kashmiris. Try to understand Kashmir, go to Kashmir, speak to people from all walks of life. you'll find very complex situations there. But something I've found, and I've interacted with hundreds, if not thousands of people there, thousands online, but also hundreds in person, there's something in common. That is the desire for Azadi. Yes, Azadi is what I'm talking about. Azadi from the occupying state. Azadi in the sense that it's about freedom. The nature of Azadi again, be it, some have said, can it be freedom within India? Can it be freedom within Pakistan? Can it be freedom from India only and joining Pakistan, or freedom from both? See, all those are secondary because Azadi essentially implies freedom expressed through right to self-determination. So Azadi would imply in political context, and without resolution of Azadi, there can be no proper imagination of post-patriarchal Kashmir. Right? So Azadi would imply freedom for Kashmiris, women, men, of all backgrounds. So when I say Kashmiri, I include of course Jammu and Kashmir, to decide for themselves once and for all what kind of state do they want to live in. Of course, some of us may have a problem with the state. I do have a problem with the state. I see myself as an anarchist to a great extent. But I am also aware that in contemporary international relations, the dominant form of political expression remains state. And therefore, we cannot resent the fact that Kashmiris may want their own state. But hopefully, Kashmir is in the struggle against the colonization by India and to an extent by Pakistan. Kashmir is in the struggle for Azadi. Kashmir is in the struggle against patriarchies of the worst kind, the colonial patriarchy, would also teach us and experiment with post-patriarchal democracy. That's my hope. But that's not personal, right? When I say democracy, I don't mean the existing democracy, but democracy, that's an ideal. Democracy that treats all human beings, regardless of the ethnicity, religion, gender, sexuality, as inherently free from all bigotries. To summarize, let us learn from Kashmiris. Let us learn to support freedom. Let us learn to support Azadi. Thank you very much.